of the vilest of them, that he had even insulted his chief, he could not deny. It was only the charge of poisoning from which he seemed to have cleared himself. This indeed the prosecutors did not adequately sustain by merely alleging that at a banquet given by Germanicus his food had been tainted with poison by the hands of Piso, who sat next above him. It seemed absurd to suppose that he would have dared such an attempt among strange servants, in the sight of so many bystanders, and under Germanicus's own eyes. And, besides, the defendant offered his slaves to the torture, and insisted on its application to the attendants on that occasion. But the judges, for different reasons, were merciless: the emperor, because war had been made on a province; the senate, because they could not be sufficiently convinced that there had been no treachery about the death of Germanicus. At the same time shouts were heard from the people in front of the senate house, threatening violence if he escaped the verdict of the senators. They had actually dragged Piso's statues to the Gemonian stairs, and were breaking them in pieces, when by the emperor's order they were rescued and replaced. Piso was then put in a litter and attended by a tribune of one of the praetorian cohorts, who followed him, so it was variously rumoured, to guard his person or to be his executioner. Plancina was equally detested, but had stronger interest. Consequently, it was considered a question how far the emperor would be allowed to go against her. While Piso's hopes were in suspense, she offered to share his lot, whatever it might be, and in the worst event to be his companion in death. But as soon as she had secured her pardon through the secret intercessions of Augusta, she gradually withdrew from her husband, and separated her defence from his. When the prisoner saw that this was fatal to him, he hesitated whether he should still persist, but at the urgent request of his sons, braced his courage, and once more entered the Senate. There he bore patiently the renewal of the accusation, the furious voices of the senators, savage opposition indeed from every quarter, but nothing daunted him so much as to see Tiberius, without pity and without anger, resolutely closing himself against any inroad of emotion. He was conveyed back to his house, where, seemingly by way of preparing his defence for the next day, he wrote a few words, sealed the paper, and handed it to a freedman. Then he bestowed the usual attention on his person. After a while, late at night, his wife having left his chamber, he ordered the doors to be closed, and at daybreak was found with his throat cut, and a sword lying on the ground. I remember to have heard old men say that a document was often seen in Piso's hands, the substance of which he never himself divulged, but which his friends repeatedly declared contained a letter from Tiberius with instructions referring to Germanicus, and that it was his intention to produce it before the Senate and upbraid the emperor, had he not been deluded by vain promises from Sejanus. Nor did he perish, they said, by his own hand, but by that of one sent to be his executioner. Neither of these statements would I positively affirm, still it would not have been right for me to conceal what was related by those who lived up to the time of my youth. The emperor, assuming an air of sadness, complained in the Senate that the purpose of such a death was to bring odium on himself, and he asked with repeated questionings how Piso had spent his last day and night. Receiving answers which were mostly judicious, though in part somewhat incautious, he read out a note written by Piso nearly to the following effect: "Crushed by a conspiracy of my foes and the odium excited by a lying charge, since my truth and innocence find no place here, I call the immortal gods to witness that towards you, Caesar, I have lived loyally, and with like dutiful respect towards your mother. and I implore you to think of my children, one of whom, Cneius, is in no way implicated in my career, whatever it may have been, seeing that all this time he has been at Rome, while the other, Marcus Piso, dissuaded me from returning to Syria. Would that I had yielded to my young son rather than he to his aged father, and therefore I pray the more earnestly that the innocent may not pay the penalty of my wickedness. By 45 years of obedience, by my association with you in the consulate, as one who formerly won the esteem of the divine Augustus your father, as one who is your friend, and will never hereafter ask a favour, I implore you to save my unhappy son. About Plancina he added not a word. Tiberius after this acquitted the young Piso of the charge of civil war, on the ground that a son could not have refused a father's orders, compassionating at the same time the high rank of the family, and the terrible downfall even of Piso himself, however he might have deserved it. For Plancina he spoke with shame and conscious disgrace, alleging in excuse the intercession of his mother, secret complaints against whom from all good men were growing more and more vehement. So it was the duty of a grandmother, people said, to look a grandson's murderess in the face, to converse with her and rescue her from the Senate. What the laws secure on behalf of every citizen had to Germanicus alone been denied. The voices of Vitellius and Veranius had bewailed a Caesar, while the Emperor and Augusta had defended Plancina. She might as well now turn her poisonings and her devices, which had proved so successful, against Agrippina and her children, and thus sate this exemplary grandmother and uncle with the blood of a most unhappy house. 2 days were frittered away over this mockery of a trial, Tiberius urging Piso's children to defend their mother. While the accusers and their witnesses pressed the prosecution with rival zeal, and there was no reply, pity rather than anger was on the increase. Aurelius Cotta, the consul, who was first called on for his vote, for when the emperor put the question, even those in office went through the duty of voting, held that Piso's name ought to be erased from the public register, half of his property confiscated, half given up to his son Cneius Piso, who was to change his first name, that Marcus Piso, stripped of his rank, with an allowance of 5 million sesterces, should be banished for 10 years, Plancina's life being spared in consideration of Augusta's intercession. Much of the sentence was mitigated by the emperor. The name of Piso was not to be struck out of the public register, since that of Marcus Antonius, who had made war on his country, and that of Julius Antonius, who had dishonoured the house of Augustus, still remained. Marcus Piso too he saved from degradation, and gave him his father's property. For he was firm enough, as I have often related, against the temptation of money, and now for very shame at Plancina's acquittal he was more than usually merciful. Again, when Valerius Messallinus and Sicinus Severus proposed respectively the erection of a golden statue in the temple of Mars the Avenger, and of an altar to vengeance, he interposed, protesting that victories over the foreigner were commemorated with such monuments, but that domestic woes ought to be shrouded in silent grief. There was a further proposal of Messallinus, that Tiberius, Augusta, Antonia, Agrippina, and Drusus ought to be publicly thanked for having avenged Germanicus. He omitted all mention of Claudius. Thereupon he was pointedly asked by Lucius Asprinus before the Senate whether the omission had been intentional, and it was only then that the name of Claudius was added. For my part, the wider the scope of my reflection on the present and the past, the more am I impressed by their mockery of human plans in every transaction. Clearly, the very last man marked out for empire